Hello and welcome to AP Psychology. My name is Mrs. Seguin and today we're going to be discussing the brain, part 1. Part 2 will be the next video, so we'll be discussing neuroplasticity at that point. Today we're going to talk about the structure of the brain. Our objectives for the day, we're going to describe the nervous system, its subdivisions, and the functions in the brain. Then we're going to identify the contributions of key researchers to the study of the brain. And then we're going to recount historic and contemporary research strategies and technologies that support the research. So how do we study the brain? And then we're going to identify the contributions of key researchers to the development of creating the tools that we use to study the brain. So we have a lot to cover today, but it shouldn't take super long. All right, the nervous system and its subdivisions and functions in the brain. These first two major brain regions control your involuntary functions, so things like breathing, heart rate, digestion, sleep patterns, that kind of thing. Your cerebellum is called the little brain. It's at the rear of the brainstem. The functions of the cerebellum include processing your sensory input, so your sight, hearing, smell, taste, touch, the things that you, stimuli that you sense, right? It coordinates movement and balance, and it enables nonverbal learning and memory. So these are things like, this would house your muscle memory, for example. If you've ever learned how to ride a bike, you get back on a bike and you know how to continue doing it, right? So that's your cerebellum. That's what would, the part of the brain that would process that system. The brainstem is the innermost region of the brain. It's the core of the brain. It is responsible for your automatic survival functions. So there's 3 parts of the brainstem. There's multiple parts, but we're going to cover 3 major ones. The medulla controls your heartbeat and your breathing. The thalamus is your sensory control center. And then the reticular formation is a nerve network that travels through the brain stem and the thalamus and plays an important role in controlling arousal. Now, I want to preface with something here. Arousal simply means spurring to action. So when you arise in the morning, you're aroused from your sleep, that kind of thing, right? When you wake up. So it's the thing that motivates you to get up. It's the thing that it makes your body act. Okay. All right, next we're going to talk about the limbic system. And the limbic system is located at the border between the brain hemispheres. It's associated with your emotions and your drives. The amygdala, there's several parts to the limbic system. The amygdala consists of 2 lima bean-sized neural clusters. These are linked to emotion, especially aggression and fear. So your more anger and fear type emotions, right? The hypothalamus, which is below the thalamus, the prefix hypo means below. It directs several maintenance activities. It helps govern the endocrine system via the pituitary gland. So remember, the pituitary gland was called the master gland. Well, the master gland has a boss, and it's the hypothalamus. And it's linked to emotion and reward. And then we get the hippocampus. This processes conscious memories. All right, the next major brain region is the cerebral cortex. Now, the cerebral cortex is where all of the voluntary function happens. It's the cerebrum, right? That's the major part of the brain. This is the thin surface layer of interconnected neural cells, so neurons, right, that are all linked together. It's your brain's thinking crown. It's the ultimate control center and processing center. Glial cells are cells in the nervous system that support, nourish, and protect neurons. And neurons, which we'll get to later, are the most basic unit of the nervous system. They may also play a role in learning and thinking, these glial cells. All right, cerebral cortex. It consists of a bunch of different lobes that all do different things, and you've probably heard some of these things before. Each hemisphere's cortex is divided into 4 lobes. So take your whole brain, right? Split it in half, down the center right here, right? And you have 2 hemispheres, just like the Earth. Each of those halves of the brain has 4 lobes. The frontal lobes, which are in the front, these are the portions of the cerebral cortex lying just behind the forehead. These are involved in speaking, muscle movement, and in making plans and judgments and decisions. The parietal lobes, these are the portion of the cerebral cortex lying at the top of the head and to the rear. So they're kind of here on that crown area, right? These receive sensory input for touch and body position. The occipital lobes These are the portion of the cerebral cortex lying at the back of the head. These include areas that receive information from your visual fields. So the occipital lobe is where you process vision. And then your temporal lobes, these are the portion of the cerebral cortex lying roughly above the ears, so they're here, okay? These include the auditory areas, so where hearing would get processed, and then each hemisphere is going to receive information from the opposite ear. So this side of my brain would process information from this ear, and vice versa. Okay, another major part of the cerebral cortex is the motor cortex. The motor cortex is an area at the rear of the frontal lobes, so the frontal lobes are here, right? So it's probably right about here, that controls voluntary movement. And then we get the somatosensory cortex. This is the area at the front of the parietal lobes, which, remember, the parietal lobe is at the crown. So it's at the front of the parietal lobe. So the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex are pretty close together. This is the area at the front of the parietal lobes that registers and processes body touch and movement sensations. All right, and then we get association areas. These are areas of the cerebral cortex that are not involved in primary motor or sensory functions. Rather, they process higher mental functioning, learning, remembering, thinking, speaking. Okay, that's the major parts of the brain. Overwhelming, I know, but we're going to do a bunch of labeling diagrams and processing this, so just breathe, we'll get through it. Number 2, we're going to identify the key contributions of researchers to the study of the brain, as well as identifying those contributions of key researchers to the development of tools for examining the brain. So we're going to look at the guys who contributed to the study of the brain, but then also the people who created the things so that we can study the brain. And that was objective 2 and 4, so we're going to cover both of those here. All right, let's talk about an aphasia. An aphasia is what's known as a language disorder that affects either production of language or comprehension of language. So production of language is the ability to speak intelligibly, right? Comprehension of language is the ability to understand language. So you're gonna need to know these guys, so write these down, right? Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke. So Paul Broca comes first, sorry. He had a patient that couldn't speak, but could clearly understand language, because he would tell him things like, whistle, and he would whistle, but he couldn't talk, right? When he died, they did an autopsy, and it showed that he had a lesion, which is basically brain damage, on the posterior part of the temporal lobe. So if you go back to your brain diagram, okay, the temporal lobe is right here, over the ear, right? So if we're dealing with the posterior, which means the back part of the temporal lobe, we're dealing with this part back here. Okay. This showed that different spots on the brain control different functions. So basically what had happened was this guy had brain damage in a specific area that would have contributed to him being able to produce intelligible language. However, so he couldn't speak, but he could clearly understand language, which tells us that language production and language comprehension operate from 2 different parts of the brain, right? So the part of the brain that is responsible for governing the mouth movements for speech is named Broca's area in the brain. So it's pretty simple, right? And then Broca's aphasia is when someone can understand language, but they can't produce it. So they can understand what you're saying, but they can't speak. Then we get Wernicke. So Wernicke kind of followed in the footsteps of Broca. He discovered Broca's work and was fascinated by it. And so he built off of Broca's work and discovered the opposite, that he had a patient who could speak, but had no concept of language. So he would speak and it would just be random words coming out. And we're going to show a video of these in class to make it a little easier. Speech would be random words and phrases, no pattern, no meaning. Words were coming out, it was fluent and it was beautiful, just like I'm talking to you, but it made no sense. So he discovered that there was a lesion on the brain that controlled understanding of language. This person could speak, but they had no clue what they were saying. They didn't understand how the language worked, right? So the part of the brain which governs word perception is known as Wernicke's area. Wernicke's aphasia is when someone can produce the language, but they don't understand it. Okay, so Broca and Wernicke, we have the diagram here. Broca's area is in the motor program, so it's controlling the mouth movements that are producing speech, right? And then Wernicke's area is in the sensory program. So it's the being able to hear and encode and do the process of understanding. Okay, and then we get Roger Sperry. Roger Sperry discovered that the human brain has specialized functions on the left and the right hemispheres. So he's really responsible for that hemispheric exclusivity that's going on, right? The specialization. So the right hemisphere doing certain things and the left hemisphere doing certain things. For discovering that the two sides can operate practically independently. So in the early 1960s, Sperry and his colleagues, including a man named Michael Gazzaniga, who will be in the next brain video, conducted extensive experiments on an epileptic patient who had his corpus callosum, which the two hemispheres, right? There's a bridge of material between the two hemispheres that connect them, and that's called the corpus callosum. His corpus callosum had been severed. So there was no connection between the left and right hemispheres of his brain. At first, the patient seemed pretty normal, but then further experimentation showed that certain activities such as naming objects or putting blocks together in a prescribed order could only be done when using one side of the brain or the other. So since the right eye connects to, well, the right eye connects to the left side of the brain, the left side of the eye connects to the right side of the brain, right? So since the right eye connects to the left brain, the left hand to the left brain, or to the right brain, and so on throughout the body, the stimulus would be given to the side of the body opposite the brain hemisphere being tested. So if you're testing the left side of the brain, you need to be putting everything in the right side of the body, right? These abilities were not absolute, so there were exceptions, but it seemed that the left hemisphere specialized in language processes and the right is dominant in visual or construction tasks. Sperry's work, eventually we helped chart a map of the brain and opened whole fields of brain study, right? And then he received the Nobel Prize in 1981. All right, so Roger Sperry's work, the major brain regions, the hemispheres, right? So they're left and right halves of the brain. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and the corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres. There's a lot of debate over what exactly is controlled. So when someone goes, I'm left-brained, that's not a thing. That's totally not a thing. Your brain operates together all the time, and you use most of your brain power most of the time. So a lot of the things that people believe about the brain are entirely false. So do your research. All right, and the third objective. We're going to recount historic and contemporary research strategies and technologies that support research. All right, how do we study the brain? The first one is selective lesioning. So lesioning is destroying specific clusters of brain cells to see the effect. You don't do this on live humans necessarily. There are certain times, very specific times, when this is necessary. But selective lesioning is destroying brain cells to see the effect on the brain. So if you destroy specific parts of the brain, what does it affect, right? Then we get the electroencephalogram. This is an amplified reading of brain waves that show brain activity, right? And we have the CT scan, you've probably heard of that, or the CAT scan. This is the computed tomography. These are X-ray photographs, and they put them together into a 3D image to show brain damage, or spots in the brain that are damaged, right? Then we get the PET scan, or the positron emission tomography scan, and this depicts brain activity by showing each brain area's consumption of glucose, because remember, any part of the body that's functioning is going to use glucose, which is the simple sugars, right? That's what your body is pulling out of the food that you eat, and converting the food that you eat into is glucose. And so the brain areas that are using more glucose are probably functioning a little harder today, right? They're working a little harder. And then we get the MRI. This is the magnetic resonance imaging. This uses magnetic fields and radio waves to produce computer-generated images of soft tissue. So, if you've ever seen an MRI, they're pretty cool. In this lesson, you learned to describe the nervous system, its subdivisions and functions. We identified key researchers to the study of the brain, as well as key researchers who developed tools for examining the brain. And then we recounted historic and contemporary research strategies and technologies that support that research. All right, I will see you in class tomorrow.